Welcome to the deep dive. If you're looking for the essential knowledge distilled from dense research, well, you're in the right place. We take the source material, pull out the crucial insights, and give you the context you need to be deeply informed, fast. Today, we're diving deep into the state of the world's oceans, specifically looking at how much we humans rely on them. Our source is a really important paper from 2013, Managing Fisheries for Human and Food Security. The lead author is Tim McClanahan, working with Allison and Joshua Cinner.
Yeah, and what's novel about this paper, I think, is that it doesn't just look at fish stocks in isolation. It takes a systematic approach, evaluating global marine fisheries through these interconnected lenses of conflict, potential, food security, and environmental vulnerability. Basically, their mission was to get beyond just the ecological decline, to understand how collapsing resources actually fuel social problems, disparity, poverty traps, that big north-south divide in marine investment.
Okay, let's unpack this, maybe starting with just the sheer scale of it all. How dependent are we globally on fisheries? Why is this so critical right now?
Oh, the numbers are huge. Fisheries and aquaculture, together, they employ something like 260 million people around the world. And economically, it's about U.S. $100 billion a year in global trade. Fish is one of the most heavily traded food commodities out there. But the problem is this whole system is under severe systemic threat. And that dramatically increases the risk for those coastal communities, the ones who rely on it most, pushing them towards marginalization.
And the paper digs into how we got here, right? Looking at the massive expansion of fishing since the 50s, what they call exposure, global yields went up, 2.4 times?
Yeah, but that sounds better than it is.
Right, because achieving that meant expanding the area being fished by 4 times. We cast a much, much wider net, basically.
Exactly. And that expansion pushed us right up against this fundamental limit. They call it the thermodynamic constraint. The study highlights this really alarming finding. By the mid-1990s, fishing was already taking over 10% of marine primary production.
Across 2/3 of the world's continental shelves.
Yeah, 2/3.
Can you maybe break down that 10% figure for us? Why is that number so worrying?
Well, primary production is the absolute base of the marine food web. It's the phytoplankton, the algae generating energy from sunlight. Everything else depends on it. So taking 10% of that baseline production year after year, it's just an unsustainable draw. It's like draining the foundation. It signals we're right near or maybe even past the maximum level the ecosystem can handle long term while staying healthy.
And given that huge, unsustainable effort, what did they find was the most severe ecological result?
Widespread biomass collapse. It's pretty stark. The research showed that somewhere between 25 and 50% of all the fish stocks that we target, they've been reduced to less than 10% of their original unfished abundance.
Below 10%.
Yeah.
And that's the definition of collapsed, right?
Functionally, yes, that's considered collapsed.
And that ecological disaster has huge social and political ripples, especially when you look at that north-south dynamic the paper gets into.
Absolutely. Demand from developed countries creates these market forces that, well, they pull high-value species, think shrimp, tuna, cod, out of developing nations. Those fish head to wealthier markets.
Yeah.
And then developing nations often end up importing cheaper, lower-value fish just to feed their own people.
So global market pressure, if it's not checked by strong local governance, just speeds up the decline in the global south.
Precisely. And as those resources dwindle and governance maybe weakens, the paper highlights this really crucial link, the potential for fisheries conflict, for real human insecurity.
We're not just talking minor disputes here. They mention historical examples, like actual fish wars.
Exactly. The classic one is the Cod Wars, back in the 50s through the 70s between Iceland and the UK. It was all triggered by Iceland extending its fishing limits because stocks were declining. When the resource base shrinks and it becomes a zero-sum game over who gets what's left, weak states or aggressive moves can easily spark wider instability.
And they bring that right up to date, don't they? Pointing to piracy off the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, as a modern example where state weakness combined with fewer opportunities for local fishing communities created this kind of power vacuum. And that vacuum gets filled by criminal activity, leading to much broader security threats.
Okay, so those are the pressures: overfishing, climate change impact, potential for conflict. How do we start to figure out who's most at risk? The paper shifts here from describing the crisis to analyzing it using a specific framework, one adapted from the IPCC.
Right, they use the vulnerability framework. It's often expressed almost like a formula. Vulnerability equals exposure plus sensitivity, all divided by adaptive capacity. It helps measure not just the threat itself, but how well a system or a community can actually cope with it.
We've touched on exposure, that's the stress, the overfishing, climate impacts. Let's dig into sensitivity. What does that mean in this context?
Sensitivity is about how much people depend on marine resources. For food, obviously, but also for income, for revenue. And it's crucial to remember this isn't just about calories or protein, it's about nutritional security. Fish provide these vital micronutrients, iron, iodine, vitamin A, that are just indispensable for health, especially for kids and mothers in low-income areas where other sources are scarce.
So a collapse isn't just an economic problem, it's a fundamental health crisis.
Absolutely. And then the third part of that equation, the denominator, is adaptive capacity, or AC.
Which is the ability of people or whole systems to adjust to change. And this is the part the study suggests we can actively work on, build up.
That's right. And we absolutely cannot forget climate change here, which is massively reshaping that exposure part of the equation. Climate models are predicting this huge redistribution of where fish will be found. High-latitude places, think Norway, Alaska, the North Atlantic, they might actually see increases in catch potential, maybe 30 to 70% more.
Wow, increases. But there's a flip side, isn't there?
A grim one, yeah. Tropical regions, Indonesia, the Philippines, chilly places, often highly sensitive, often lower income. They're projected to see potential catches drop by around 40%.
40%. So climate change basically heaps more pressure onto the communities that are already most dependent and least equipped to handle it.
It geographically worsens the existing problem, exactly, pushing vulnerable communities even closer to the edge.
Yeah.
And this brings us right to a really tricky challenge. Measurement. How do you accurately measure that sensitivity, especially across different scales, like nationally versus down in a specific village?
And this is where we hit what you call the scaling paradox, right?
Mhm.
This is where it gets really interesting. The paper found this big mismatch. National statistics often completely miss or underestimate how sensitive coastal communities really are.
Yeah, that was a key finding. Take the Western Indian Ocean, the WIO, as an example they looked at closely. Nationally, for countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Madagascar, the stats might suggest fisheries are, a moderate part of the economy. Not insignificant, but not dominant. But then, when researchers actually went to the villages, did household surveys, talked to people, they found incredibly high dependence on fishing. Often it was the main source of income and food for entire communities.
So the national average just smoothed it all out, hiding the intense vulnerability right there on the coast.
Exactly. Because fishing might be a tiny fraction of the national GDP, but it could be 80% of a particular community's entire livelihood. You lose that national perspective sometimes.
Which really underlines why we need this very contextual diagnostic approach, not just broad strokes. So what were the main sort of vulnerability profiles the study identified at the national level?
Using their index, mainly focused on coral reef fisheries data, they saw two common patterns emerge, needing quite different policy responses. First, you have low-income countries that generally have low adaptive capacity across the board. For them, policies really need to focus squarely on building that capacity, foundational stuff.
Okay, build capacity first. What was the second group?
The second group was more middle-income countries. And here's the paradox bit again. These nations might have higher adaptive capacity overall, maybe better infrastructure, education systems, but their coastal populations often show extremely high sensitivity to fisheries decline. Maybe they're specialized or lack alternatives right there.
So for them, the priority shifts.
Right. For that group, the main policy lever needs to be focused on decreasing that sensitivity, reducing the direct dependence on that specific stressed resource, helping people diversify.
That distinction is so important. It explains why these generic one-size-fits-all solutions from, international bodies often just don't work on the ground. Okay, let's break down adaptive capacity then. If we need to build it, especially in low-income settings, what are the components? The paper lists four, starting with flexibility.
Flexibility is essentially the ability to switch gears, to move between different ways of making a living. It's about having options. And they found this is absolutely critical for escaping what they term poverty traps.
And the Kenya case study showed this.
Yeah, it illustrated it really well. The fishers who were poorest, who had the fewest other skills or assets, they were the ones most likely to just stay in the fishery, even as it was collapsing.
Yeah.
They'd often take bigger risks, use more destructive gear just to get by. They lacked the flexible assets, maybe education, savings, other job skills, to just switch to something else.
So they get locked into this negative cycle, declining fish stocks, deepening poverty.
Exactly, a classic poverty trap dynamic.
But the second component of AC is assets. This covers resources, technology, but also the state of the ecosystem itself. And aquaculture comes up here.
Yes, fish farming. It's massive now, providing almost half of all the seafood we eat globally, Huge potential asset.
But
But the benefits are really skewed geographically. Asia totally dominates production. And more importantly, the benefits don't automatically trickle down to the most vulnerable.
we need to ask, is this farmed fish actually boosting food security for those communities who need the micronutrients? Or is it mostly becoming an export commodity for wealthier markets, maybe even competing with local small-scale fishers? So the distribution and access to those assets matter just as much as the total production.
Absolutely. And linked to that is the idea of natural assets. The fish stocks themselves, the health of the reefs or mangroves. Maintaining high fish biomass and healthy ecosystems is vital. The paper warns that once you push a system past certain ecological switch points thresholds, it can change really fast and recovery becomes incredibly difficult, sometimes maybe impossible.
So protecting what's left is usually far cheaper and more effective than trying to rebuild it later.
Definitely. Prevention is better than cure, especially in complex ecosystems.
The third attribute of adaptive capacity is learning. This sounds like it's about people and institutions being able to recognize change and understand those links between what we do and what happens to the environment.
Precisely. It requires building social trust, sharing information, having ways for communities to participate in management.
And they had that example from Kenya again, the adaptive management program.
Yeah, a really positive case study. Through open discussions with stakeholders, getting buy-in, and then implementing specific gear restrictions like banning nets with tiny mesh sizes that catch baby fish, they actually saw fisher incomes go up.
Significantly up, right? 40 to 135% increases.
Yeah, huge gains. And that success was built entirely on local learning, on the community seeing and accepting the direct link between changing their fishing practices and improving their own economic future.
Okay, and the final piece of AC is social organization. This is about the institutions, the rules, the governance structures.
Right. And here they draw heavily on Eleanor Ostrom's work on managing common resources. Things like having clearly defined boundaries for who can fish where, giving communities real collective choice rights over how resources are managed. These local, community-driven rules are often essential for long-term sustainability.
And looking at existing fisheries governance around the world, what did the researchers find were the common weak spots? Where does social organization tend to fall down?
Three things really stood out as consistently weak in many places. First, a lack of real accountability for the people enforcing the rules. Who watches the watchers? Second, not having effective graduated sanctions. Penalties that increase for repeat offenses, rather than just ignoring minor infractions until things get really bad.
Okay, accountability and sanctions. What was the third?
And this one is critical. The failure to consistently monitor the state of the resource, how many fish are there, and then feed that information back to the local users in a timely, understandable way.
So people can adapt their own fishing based on what's actually happening out there.
Exactly. Without that feedback loop, learning is basically impossible. You're flying blind.
Okay, so we have this detailed framework, vulnerability, adaptive capacity. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, what does it all mean for policy? How do we actually use these insights to improve human security and food security globally?
Well, the recommendations that flow from this analysis are pretty clear, and some are definitely politically challenging. First, reduce the bad incentives. That means fewer subsidies for fuel or boats, less capital investment pouring into already overcapacity fishing fleets. Stop subsidizing overfishing, basically.
Makes sense.
Second, enforce precautionary management. Protect the resources we still have. Don't wait until they're collapsing to act. Be conservative.
Okay, reduce subsidies, manage cautiously, and the third one sounded quite radical.
Yes, the third is about sequence development intervention. This is a really crucial idea. They argue you need a specific order. First, secure basic human rights, safety, health, education. Then, establish clear and secure exclusive fishing rights for local communities. Give them ownership and control.
And only after those foundations are in place.
Only after rights and basic needs are secured should you then focus on integrating those fisheries into global markets.
Why that specific order? What's the risk of doing it the other way around?
The risk, they argue, is that if you push for global market integration too early, before local rights and governance or strong, powerful outside market forces just flood in, they can overwhelm local management, drive unsustainable harvesting for export, and ultimately undermine the livelihoods and food security of the very coastal communities that depend on the resource most. The sequencing is designed to protect the vulnerable first.
That makes a lot of sense. Build the foundation before you build the skyscraper on top.
A good analogy, yeah.
But like any study, this one had its limitations. What were the main gaps they pointed out?
A big one was data availability. For many small island developing states, or SIDZ places often highly dependent on fisheries, there just wasn't enough good quality public data to include them fully in the most detailed vulnerability assessments.
Which means we might be missing the picture for some of the most vulnerable places.
Potentially, yes. And it highlights the need for better data collection and sharing, especially at local scales.
And the other main gap.
It really comes back to that need for a contextual diagnostic approach we talked about. Sweeping general solutions aren't the answer. Any governance reform, any new policy, needs a careful prior assessment of how it's likely to impact the most dependent, the most food insecure people in that specific place. Context matters enormously.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive really shows that the global fisheries crisis, it's not just an ecological problem, is it?
Not at all. It's fundamentally rooted in human security, in governance challenges. It's about how complex market forces, often weak institutions, and now accelerating climate change all combine to threaten the nutrition, the livelihoods, the very future of hundreds of millions of people.
Absolutely. And it seems the future contribution of fish to global food security won't come from somehow catching vastly more fish. We're already
Yeah.
pushing limits there.
No, probably not.
It's going to depend much more on figuring out equitable access, on building these highly accountable governance systems, making sure fish doesn't just become another luxury commodity, unavailable to the poor communities who rely on it for basic health and development.
Exactly. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Where do we go from here? I think if you really want to grapple with solving this crisis, you have to start looking into concepts like environmental justice frameworks, specifically applied to fisheries governance. That's where the real work needs to happen, focusing policy squarely on who benefits, who bears the risks, and ultimately, who gets to control and steward these vital resources for the long haul.
A crucial perspective, definitely a central reading, or at least understanding, for anyone concerned with the ocean, the economy, and global stability. Thank you for diving deep with us today.